This machine does it all. It cuts mortises, it cuts tenons, it does corner joinery, it does marquetry and inlay and letter carving, and it might be killing the craft of woodworking. Shit. Let me tell you why. So, I need to set some hinges in a cabinet I've been working on for seemingly 7 eternities.
It's been 84 years.
And I could cut those hinge mortises with this machine, but what if I don't want to?
Oh my God.
What if I want to develop real hand tool skills? Or what if I just don't like working around loud, dusty machines all day long? Or what if I don't have the financial flexibility to afford a machine like this? Those are real and fair and genuine concerns that we should contend with on a platform like YouTube for the hobbyist woodworkers. So here's what I want to do. I want to show you 3 different methods for setting a hinge in a cabinet. The first, I'm going to do very, very simply with nothing more than 3 hand tools: a square, a knife, and a chisel. Now the second will involve a couple of power tools, but nothing more than a normal hobbyist would have in their shop. A couple of basic tools to make accurate, repeatable hinge mortises that you can do over and over again. Now this is the method I learned years ago when I was working in cabinet shops. This is how we did it at speed and without the use of CNCs. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this machine, the killer of craft,
The slayer of skill.
the portable CNC known as the Shaper Origin. And we're going to talk about what it does, whether it's good for the craft as a whole, and importantly, my honest opinion on whether I think that you as a hobbyist need to purchase this machine. So let's get busy. So the first step in laying out any mortise, hand tools, machines, whatever your chosen method is to lay out the location of the mortise and make sure that you have a good clamping system so that you can work the piece of wood safely on your workbench. And oftentimes I just use double stick tape because it's the easiest and I'm too lazy to put a tail vise on my workbench. So if you don't have a tail vise or you don't have a proper joiner's bench, don't sleep on double stick tape as a legitimate clamping system. Now, as far as the layout for this particular style of hinge goes, this is called an offset knife hinge. So it's a little bit different from, say, your standard butt hinge, but the process of actually doing the mortise itself is the same. The layout changes, however. You see that little knuckle that's sticking out in front of there? That needs to be set at a particular distance from the front edge. So that knuckle needs to be set half the diameter of that circle to the front edge. And in this particular, without getting too deep down the rabbit hole, this particular piece needs to be set 3/4 of an inch back from the front edge. So that's where the measurement started, and then I squared everything up, made myself a nice strong knife wall so that I could come in with a chisel and start clearing out the waste. And once I establish all of these shoulders, just by paring it back and chopping down and reestablishing that knife wall and chopping down a little bit more, then I can remove all of the waste. It's really just establishing where the hinge will sit and then removing a bunch of material in order to get down to the proper depth. Now, in order to know what my depth is, I'm marking it on the front edge here. So I just used my square to set the thickness of the hinge itself, mark the depth of my mortise on my front piece of wood, and then I can come in with a sharp piece of steel and just remove everything. Now this material is butternut, so it's nice and soft. It's really pleasant and easy to work with hand tools. So bear that in mind when you're chopping mortises, what the material is that you're actually working. If I was working in, say, curly maple, I would have a lot harder of a time because maple is much more dense, and the curl in that is going to change the grain direction from the front edge of the mortise to the back edge. It's just going to be all kinds of squirrely and difficult to work. And if I'm working in something like Cocobolo, well, I don't know why you're a masochist. That's a terrible idea to hand chop mortises in Cocobolo, but you know, we're woodworkers. We want to explore interesting and difficult and different woods. So just bear in mind the density of the material will absolutely affect the quality or the pleasant nature of working with hand tools. So there you go. Nice and simple. I mean, this is as basic as it can get. I didn't even use a router plane to make sure that the bottom of this mortise was leveled off. That was all just done by eye. And you can see, genuinely, there's no, the variability in depth on this mortise is absolutely minimal. So it can be done with nothing more than a chisel, a square, and a knife. Now, is this method good for beginners? Yeah, of course it is, for a number of reasons. Number one, developing real skill is important. I use machines in my work all the time, but I never wanted to be limited by what a machine could do. And by incorporating hand tool skills, it opens up literally anything that I have in my head to do to a piece of wood. So developing those skills is important, but equally as important is cheap. You can get an inexpensive 1/4-inch chisel for a couple of bucks. A knife, this is what, like a $7 knife, and this is still the knife I use to lay out most of my joinery, so it's pretty inexpensive. And then a square, which you can get for about $15 at the big box stores. Now this is a 4-inch, you can use a 12-inch, it's no difference. The important part is, of course, having this sliding mechanism that can lock down in place. As far as the short grain issues over here go, I know some of you guys are gonna be a little bit worried about that, and in fairness, this is just the difficulties of working with this offset knife hinge. They do require you to be inset from the outside of the cabinet a little bit, so that will become an issue in some circumstances, but you can design around that. That's just, I did it that way to show you that it can be done. Yes, the end grain blew out. Am I gonna lose sleep over that? No. So, hand tools, check and check. Hand tools, while good and wonderful, and still a thing I very much enjoyed doing, so I still use that method from time to time, they are, admittedly, rather time inefficient.
Oh yeah. Cool.
And let's say I have a dozen mortise mortises to put into a cabinet or multiple cabinets, and let's say I'm running a small business or I'm a hobbyist with only a few minutes a week to actually be in the shop making things, then time becomes a real consideration. Now you may set that aside and say, I just want to do it with hand tools, and that again is totally fine. But if time is a consideration and efficiency is a consideration for you, how are you gonna go about making accurate, repeatable hinge mortises? I got it right that time. How are you gonna do that in a more efficient manner? That's where this bad boy comes in. Now I've got bad news for you guys. If we're gonna make an accurate jig, it starts by doing math. You can see the collet I'm using is about 1/4 of an inch tall, and it's 3/8 of an inch to the outside diameter of that collet. Now I have a 1/4 inch bit in there, so that's a difference of 1/8 of an inch from the bit to the collet. We need to remember that. We need to take measurements for our hinge, so it's a 1/2 inch wide, it's about 2 inches long, and the back edge to the center of that knuckle is 3/4 of an inch. Remember when I said earlier that the back edge of the hinge mortise needs to be 3/4 of an inch back from the front edge of the piece? That's why, that's the center of that knuckle. So we need to have those measurements be dead on, but this is where the math becomes an issue, because if I need a 1/2 inch wide hinge mortise and I have a differential of 1/8 between the diameter of my cutter and the diameter of my collet, then I need to account for that differential in this jig. So my width of my jig is actually going to be 5/8 of an inch. Now I know I'm just throwing out numbers and there's no context for it, so let's actually talk about this in real terms with the pieces that I have. I have this center strip that I cut at 5/8 of an inch. I have this front edge that I cut, which is the distance from the front edge of the piece to the back of the mortise, plus whatever cleat I put on there. So if I need that to be 3/4 of an inch from the front edge of the piece, and I want to have a 1 inch cleat on the bottom, then that piece becomes 1 3/4 inches. Then I mark out the length of my mortise, which again was 2 inches, plus the 1/8 inch differential, so it becomes 2 1/8. I cut out that waist, I do the same thing for where the knuckle lies, and then I put these two strips or these two runners on the side so that when I glue everything together, there's something anchoring it there. Now when making an initial jig like this, using the CA glue and yellow glue trick, the combination there, is a perfectly legitimate tactic. I use that all the time. But if I were going to use this template to make hundreds or thousands of mortises, I would then take this thing I'm making right now, I would take it to a solid piece of MDF or HDF, and I would use it as a template to make a solid surface jig, so it's one continuous piece.
But once I have my cleat and everything established and on there and ready to go, I'm going to set my depth to the thickness of my hinge, make sure that it's dead on, and then I can get to routing my mortise. Now, just like before, I'm going to use double stick tape as a clamping method. Guys, I can't stress enough how useful double stick tape is in the shop. If you're not using it because it's expensive, yeah, it's not cheap, I'm not gonna lie to you, but it is. I use double stick tape literally every day. There's not a single day in the shop that I don't use it. So I'm going to lay out where my mortise needs to be with a pencil. I'm gonna drop my template right on there, and I'm going to template route it. Couple of passes, not too aggressive, and then I get a nice clean mortise that I can come in and square up the edges. Now, when I route a thing, of course, a router bit is round, so I have to come in and clean up the corners. I don't have to do that when I'm chopping it by hand, but it's a lot faster to route it out and square up the corners than it is to chop the entire thing by hand. And that time saving compounds. This is where making a template once to do a thing 100 times becomes a time saver. If I'm only doing one, it might not make sense for me to make a template. It might not make sense for me to take the time to invest in a router jig, but if I'm doing a whole bunch of them, it sure does. Now we need to talk about adjusting our jig a little bit, because you see the back line there is not clean. It's a little bit gappy at the back. The front looks good, but it's a little gappy at the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some blue tape, which has, I don't know what the thickness of blue tape is, but it does have a thickness. And I'm going to pad out the back of my jig with the blue tape. Now you can see me adding a little bit more to one side because that line was ever so slightly tapered from one edge to the other. I'm gonna put them in there. I'm gonna make sure it's pressed down really, really nicely with a ruler or a square. I'm gonna remove all of the waste so that it's not affecting the cutting action of the router bit itself. And then I'm gonna try it again. I'm gonna give it a second go and see if it works. And I have to pad it out or adjust it a little bit more. This is the initial template making that's happening right now. So I'm gonna make my cut. I'm gonna see how it fits in the without squaring up the corners, of course. So it's just a guess as to how it's gonna look, but it looks good. So then I can come in there, square up my corners, and try to make sure that this thing is gonna fit nicely. And I mean, you can't do much better than that.
So it does take a little bit of dialing in, but once you get it set, this thing, I mean, I could run probably 50 to 100 hinge mortises off of here, and it would be just fine before it starts to wear down and I have to make another one. Listen, here's if you're looking for the sign, in my opinion, of somebody who really works accurately without the use of CNCs, look at their jigs, and they will almost always have blue tape on one component of them to make sure that they fit just right. Now, that's not always the case. There are people who are much better at making jigs than I am, but usually the best craftspeople have just like a sign that it wasn't absolutely perfect and they want to fit it by a thou or two. That's where that blue tape becomes a real benefit.
A blessing from the Lord. God be praised.
This has been done this way for many, many a year, and there's no reason to stop doing it that way. And so, finally we come to this. The crux of the argument, the skill slayer itself, the portable CNC known as the Shaper Origin. Is it necessary? Is it even good? Is it a thing that you as a hobbyist should buy? We will answer those questions, but first, I'm going to show you how I use it in a circumstance like this.
All right, we will dive into using the Origin, but the first thing I want to point out here is the setup for this particular style of hinge, because again, I know people are going to be upset about that little bit of short grain that happened at the very beginning in the hand tool section. This is why I did that, because when you're setting these offset knife hinges in a cabinet, that offset from the edge is what establishes your gap against the wall. So there was a method to my madness. There was a reason for doing that. And here I just used a spacer of 3 cards. Now I have to disassemble the cabinet because it's really hard to get a router in butted up right next to a wall. So I haven't glued this thing together yet. It's just been clamped in. And now we come to the Origin. And rather than try to give you an overly simplistic explanation of how this machine works, I'm just going to let the people at Shaper do it.
There are 3 basic steps to working with Origin: scan, design, and cut. Using a marker system to orient itself, Origin is able to create a map on your work surface where you can place your digital files.
That's basically it. It's just a computer that reads a bunch of dots to know where it is in space, and if you want more information about that, I will link that video and their website below. But now let's get back to how I use it. Now, in its simplest form, in this particular instance, I want you to think of the Origin as essentially an electronic version of the jig that I just made. I've got an electronic file of the hinge in the machine itself, so it knows exactly what shape and size that mortise needs to be. I can take that plate that it's sitting on and set it anywhere on a piece of wood that essentially functions the same as the jig that I just created. And then I take the router and route it the exact same way that I did with the analog version. And then once I know that the mortise is the appropriate size, I can check it the same way I did before. I can come in with a chisel and I can square up the corners the exact same way as before. And in a matter of minutes, without making a template, I have a perfectly fitting hinge mortise. Now, I understand that not everybody wants to exist and play in the digital space. I totally get that, and I'm not going to judge you for it. But this is where this machine becomes hyper valuable to me as somebody who runs a small business and has to be mindful of efficiency. Is I can take this plate and set it anywhere, and I can go into the tool, into something called the hardware catalog on Shaper Hub, and just simply download the file for hundreds and hundreds of different pieces of hardware, and then I essentially have the digital version of the jig that I spent an hour making earlier. And in a matter of moments, I can download that file, set the tool where I need it to go, and route out the mortise at the appropriate place. And once that mortise is in place, then I can just move on to the next thing, which is what I'm doing right here. I can fit my center door so that all of my gaps are going to be correct. And then I can take the said perfectly fitting door, put it in my workstation, which is just another version of that plate you saw me working with a moment ago. And I can route out the other side of the mortise. So now this is a straight knife hinge. We haven't talked about this yet, but now this thing is done. And I can do the exact same thing on my big doors. I can fit them. I can make sure all of my gaps are nice and clean. And I can incorporate hand tools as much as I like to, because I do really enjoy working with hand tools. Take a couple of shavings with a hand plane, get the gaps just right. And then I can set up the plate to work on edge, download the files where it needs to go, just like I did before. And I can route the other side of the hinge mortise on my door. Square it up with a chisel, as I've done 7-8 times now, and check the fit. And as you can see, again, just like the analog template, you can't get much better than that. Now, I have to actually move on before I can fit these doors to trimming up these edge pieces. This is a thing I did in another video. I'll link it above if you want to go check it out. Essentially just a bunch of bent laminations that are being used as the pulls or the handles for these doors. They've been oversized for weeks. So now I'm going to go and trim them up to make sure that these doors can fit where they need to go in their final resting place. This was, if you are at all interested, incredibly nerve-wracking because it took days to get all of those things just right. But now they're done, now they're trimmed, and we're gonna go ahead and fit this door in its final place. So I'm gonna pop it in, then I have to pop the top hinge in and drop some screws in, and bada bing, bada boom. It's a beautiful thing.
So, finally we come to the $1 million question. Is this thing killing the craft of woodworking? Well, no. No, of course it isn't. And anyone who suggests that it is either a fearmonger or a Luddite.
Damn. I'm sorry.
We have a long history of technological innovation in the woodworking space, and maybe an equally long history of people fighting back against that evolution. So let's go through a little history lesson. Edward Barnsley was a prominent British furniture maker in the 20th century. He was in Britain, and he is largely considered one of the founding fathers of the arts and crafts movement. He has this really deep love of hand-chopped mortises, for example. And when he was running his business in the first half of the 20th century, he adopted a thing called the hollow chisel mortiser. Many of us use it. Many of you may have it in your shop. It is a thing to help you make square holes in a piece of wood so that the mortises themselves are faster and more efficient. And we think of this as a tool that is used by people who are highly trained craftsmen because they are not using a thing like a CNC. But you see, Edward had a real problem with them. He accepted them because he had to for the sake of his business and his employees, but he lamented the sound of mortises being chopped being lost to time. Change was hard for him to accept, but he accepted it because he had to. And now we don't even think about the hollow chisel mortiser as a lesser than way to cut a mortise. Now here's another fun historical example. Tabitha Babbitt was a shaker in the early 1800s. And she, you may or may not know this fact, is the person who invented the circular saw.
What?
So just pause real quick. For any folks, and I know none of you watching are this type of person, but for any folks who like to leave hateful comments on women's videos where they're making things out of wood and say that they don't belong in the wood shop.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
A woman invented the circular saw. The circular saw became the table saw. The table saw became the router and also the chop saw. Like any number of spinning, cutty things in your shop, all of those were invented by a woman. So there's that. The reason that Tabitha Babbitt invented the circular saw was because she saw two people in a pit using a pit saw slabbing a log, and she thought 50% of their motion is wasted. So she invented a machine that would use 100% of their motion. And while I don't have any actual historical examples of this, I guarantee you that some old dogs set in their ways were very much against this evolution because they knew how to do one thing. And this new thing meant they had to learn how to do something new, and they didn't want to do it, and they thought it took less skill or less strength or whatever it was. I would be willing to bet you all the whiskey I own.
How dare you?
That there were people who refused to use this new circular saw because it took less skill. And how many of you have something that rotates and cuts wood in your shop now? And we don't even remotely consider that a crutch or a less skilled way to approach it. It's just a different way to approach it because time and evolution happen and then we accept it into the fold. So again, is this machine killing the craft? No, it's not. Do you need to buy this machine? No, you don't. Of course you don't need to. It's not a necessary object no more than any other tool that you own is necessary. You can do woodworking without a table saw. You can do woodworking without hand planes or chisels. What this is just another tool in the shop. Will it make your life faster? Yeah. Will it make your life easier? It makes my life easier. I don't know about yours. Does that mean that you should get it if you are not going to use it? No, because then it would be a waste of money. That's it. That's the whole game, friends. It's just another tool in your tool belt. So, there it is, friends. Another video, another technique. I hope this was helpful and interesting for you, and I hope something in there was applicable for you, whether it was the way that I choose to be more efficient in my shop so that you can be more efficient with your time in your own home shop, or just the breadth of skills that you can employ, remembering that there's always more than one way to do a thing. And whatever way you want to do it is probably the best way to do it. Do it that way. It's all good, guys. We are all on the same page in that the thing that we love is making things out of wood. Go enjoy the process. That's all I have to say. If there's anything out of this video that you take away, go enjoy the process. Now I am gonna go finish this bloody cabinet so that I can actually enjoy it being done. So go make a thing, and I will catch y'all in the next video. Cheers.